to TV cameras. Then, for this hearing, they canceled the multiple rounds of initial questioning
Secretary of State for Political Affairs for the Department of State, a position he has held since August 30, 2018. Mr. Hale joined the Foreign Service in 1984 and holds the rank of Career Ambassador. He previously served as the Ambassador to Pakistan, Ambassador to Lebanon, Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, Deputy Special Envoy, and Ambassador to Jordan. Ambassador Hale also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Executive Assistant to Secretary of State Albright. Laura Cooper is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia at the Department of Defense. She is a career member of the Senior Executive Service. Ms. Cooper previously served as a Principal Director in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Global Security Affairs. Prior to joining the Department of Defense in 2001, Ms. Cooper was a Policy Planning Officer at the State Department in the Office of Coordinator of Counterterrorism. Two final points before witnesses are sworn. First, witness depositions as part of this inquiry were unclassified in nature, and all open hearings will also be held at the unclassified level. Any information that may touch unclassified information will be addressed separately. And second, Congress will not tolerate any reprisal, threat of reprisal, or attempt to retaliate against any U.S. government official for testifying before Congress, including you or any of your colleagues. If you would both please rise and raise your right hand, I'll begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. The microphone is sensitive, so please speak directly into it. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Ambassador Hale, if you have an opening statement, you're free to give that, and immediately thereafter, Ms. Cooper, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a prepared opening statement, but I would like to just comment, of course, as you said, I've been Undersecretary since August of 2018, a Foreign Service officer for over 35 years, an ambassador 3 times, serving both Republican and Democratic administrations proudly. And I'm here in response to your subpoena to answer the questions of the committee.
Thank you, Undersecretary. Ms. Cooper.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of this committee, I appear today to provide facts and answer questions based on my experience as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. I would first like to describe my background as well as my role and vantage point relevant to your inquiry. I bring to my daily work and to this proceeding my sense of duty to U.S. national security, not to any political party. I have proudly served 2 Democratic and 2 Republican presidents. I entered government service through the Presidential Management Internship Competition, joining the State Department in 1999 to work on counterterrorism in Europe and the former Soviet Union. Inspired by working with the U.S. military on a Department of Defense rotational assignment, I decided to accept a civil service position in the policy organization of the Office of the Secretary of Defense in January 2001, where I have remained for the past 18 years. My strong sense of pride in serving my country and dedication to my Pentagon colleagues were cemented in the moments after I felt the Pentagon shake beneath me on September 11, 2001. My office was scheduled to move into the section of the Pentagon that was destroyed in the attack, but a construction delay meant that we were still at our old desks in the adjacent section on that devastating day. After we had wiped the black dust from our desks and tried to get back to work, I found meaning by volunteering to work on Afghanistan policy and would give my next 4 years to this mission. I later had the opportunity to move into the leadership ranks of my organization and have had the privilege to manage issues ranging from defense strategic planning to homeland defense and mission assurance. I accepted the position of Principal Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in 2016 and was honored to be appointed formally to the position of Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in 2018. In my current role, I work to advance U.S. national security with a focus on deterring Russian aggression and building strong partnerships with the frontline states of Ukraine and Georgia, as well as 10 other allies and partners from the Balkans to the Caucasus. Strengthening Ukraine's capacity to defend itself against Russian aggression is central to my team's mission. The United States and our allies provide Ukraine with security assistance because it is in our national security interest to deter Russian aggression around the world. We also provide security assistance so that Ukraine can negotiate a peace with Russia from a position of strength. The human toll continues to climb in this ongoing war, with 14,000 Ukrainian lives lost since Russia's 2014 invasion. These sacrifices are continually in my mind as I lead DoD efforts to provide vital training and equipment, including defensive lethal assistance to the Ukrainian armed forces. I have also supported a robust Ukrainian Ministry of Defense program of defense reform to ensure the long-term sustainability of U.S. investments and the transformation of the Ukrainian military from a Soviet model to a NATO interoperable force. The National Defense Authorization Act requires the Department of Defense to certify defense reform progress to release half of the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, or USAI, funds, a provision we find very helpful. Based on recommendations from me and other key DoD advisors, the Department of Defense, in coordination with the Department of State, certified in May 2019 that Ukraine had, quote, taken substantial actions to make defense institutional reforms for the purposes of decreasing corruption, increasing accountability, and sustaining improvements of combat capability, unquote, meriting obligation of the entire $250 million in USAI funds. This brings me to the topic of today's proceedings. I would like to recap my recollection of the timeline in which these events played out. I testified about all of this at length in my deposition. In July, I became aware of a hold being placed on obligation of the State Department's Foreign Military Financing, or FMF, and DoD's USAI funds. In a series of interagency meetings, I heard that the President had directed the Office of Management and Budget to hold the funds because of his concerns about corruption in Ukraine. Let me say at the outset that I have never discussed this or any other matter with the President and never heard directly from him about this matter. At a senior-level meeting I attended on July 26th, chaired by National Security Council leadership, as at all other interagency meetings on this topic of which I was aware, the national security community expressed unanimous support for resuming the funding as in the U.S. national security interest. At the July 26th meeting, there was also a discussion of how Ukrainian anti-corruption efforts were making progress. DoD reiterated what we had said in our earlier certification to Congress, stating that sufficient progress in defense reform, including anti-corruption, had occurred to justify the USAI spending. I and others at the interagency meetings felt that the matter was particularly urgent because it takes time to obligate that amount of money, and my understanding was that the money was legally required to be obligated by September 30th, the end of the fiscal year. In the ensuing weeks until the hold was released on September 11th, I pursued 3 tracks. First, starting on July 31st at an interagency meeting, I made clear to the interagency leadership my understanding that once DoD reaches the point at which it does not have sufficient time to obligate all the funding by the end of the fiscal year, there were only 2 ways to discontinue obligation of USAI: a President-directed rescission or a DoD-directed reprogramming action, either of which would need to be notified to Congress. I never heard that either was being pursued. Second, I was in communication with the DoD Security Assistance implementing community to try to understand exactly when they would reach the point at which they would be unable to obligate all the funds by the end of the fiscal year. I received a series of updates, and in a September 5th update, I and other senior Defense Department leaders were informed that over $100 million could not be obligated by September 30th. And third, I was advocating for a meeting of the cabinet-level principals with the President to explain why the assistance should go forward. Although I heard of attempts to discuss the issue with the President, I never received details about any conversations other than a status update that the hold had not been lifted. After the decision to release the funds on September 11th of this year, my colleagues across the DoD Security Assistance enterprise worked tirelessly to be able to ultimately obligate about 86% of the funding by the end of the fiscal year, more than they had originally estimated they would be able to. Due to a provision in September's continuing resolution appropriating an amount equal to the unobligated funds from fiscal year 2019, we ultimately will be able to obligate all of the USAI funds. Given how critical these funds are for bolstering Ukraine's security and deterring Russia, I appreciate this congressional action. That concludes my opening statement, but before answering your questions, there is one other matter I would like to address. I testified in a deposition before this committee and other committees on October 23rd, 2019. At that time, I was asked questions about what I knew about when the Ukrainian government may have learned about any hold on security assistance funds. I answered those questions based on my knowledge at that time. Since my deposition, I have again reviewed my calendar, and the only meeting where I recall a Ukrainian official raising the issue with me is on September 5th at the Ukrainian Independence Day celebration. I have, however, since learned some additional information about this subject from my staff. Prior to my deposition testimony, I avoided discussing my testimony with members of my staff or anyone other than my attorney to ensure that my deposition testimony was based only on my personal knowledge. My deposition testimony was publicly released on November 11th, 2019. Members of my staff read the testimony and have come to me since then and provided additional information. Specifically, on the issue of Ukraine's knowledge of the hold or of Ukraine asking questions about possible issues with the flow of assistance, my staff showed me 2 unclassified emails that they received from the State Department. One was received on July 25th at 2:31 p.m. That email said that the Ukrainian Embassy and House Foreign Affairs Committee are asking about security assistance. The second email was received on July 25th at 4:25 p.m. That email said that the Hale knows about the FMF situation to an extent, and so does the Ukrainian Embassy. I did not receive either of these emails. My staff does not recall informing me about them, and I do not recall being made aware of their content at the time. I do not have any additional information about precisely what the Ukrainians may have said, what may have been their source of information about a hold or any possible issues with the flow of assistance, or what the State Department officials may have told them. My staff also advised me in the last few days of the following additional facts that may be relevant to this inquiry. Again, my staff does not recall informing me about them, and I do not recall being made aware of this. On July 3rd at 4:23 p.m., they received an email from the State Department stating that they had heard that the CN is currently being blocked by OMB. This apparently refers to the congressional notification state would send for Ukraine FMF. I have no further information on this. On July 25th, a member of my staff got a question from a Ukraine embassy contact asking what was going on with Ukraine security assistance. Because at that time, we did not know what the guidance was on USAI. The OMB notice of apportionment arrived that day, but this staff member did not find out about it until later. I was informed that the staff member told the Ukrainian official that we were moving forward on USAI, but recommended that the Ukraine embassy check in with state regarding the FMF. Sometime during the week of August 6 to 10, a Ukraine embassy officer told a member of my staff that a Ukrainian official might raise concerns about security assistance in an upcoming meeting. My understanding is that the issue was not, in fact, raised. Again, I have no further information about what concerns about the security assistance Ukraine may have had at that time. My staff also recall thinking that Ukrainians were aware of the hold on security assistance during August, but they cannot pinpoint any specific conversations where it came up. My staff told me they are aware of additional meetings where they saw officials from the Ukrainian embassy in August, and they believe that the question of the hold came up at some point. But they told me they did not find any corresponding email or other records of those meetings. Consequently, neither they nor I know precisely when or what additional discussions may have occurred with the Ukrainians in the month of August. If I had more details on these matters, I would offer them to the committee, but this is the extent of additional information I have received since my deposition. Mr. Chairman, I welcome your questions. I will answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. For this hearing, we will forego the first round of questions by committee counsel and immediately proceed to member questions under the 5-minute rule. I do want to respond to the comments of my ranking member, however, that I think suggested that this was a surprise to the minority. We informed the minority last night after our hearing that we would, because of the nature of the testimony today, we did not believe that a staff member round was necessary. And the message we got back from the minority was, okay, got it, thanks for the heads up. So the minority was on notice. It raised no objection about going directly to member rounds. I also want to point out that the minority has represented that we have not called any minority witnesses. That is not accurate. Mr. Hale appears tonight as a minority witness. I know that's not how you characterize yourself, Mr. Hale, but your testimony was requested by the minority. Likewise, 2 of the witnesses yesterday, Ambassador Volker, as well as Mr. Morrison, were both minority requested witnesses. Now, Ambassador Volker testified that he didn't believe any of the allegations against Joe Biden, and in retrospect that he should have understood that an investigation into Burisma was really an investigation into Biden, which he acknowledged would be inappropriate. And Mr. Morrison gave testimony as to conversations that he had with Ambassador Sondland about the conversations that he had relayed to the Ukrainians about the hold on security assistance being a result of the failure to secure the investigation. So I can understand why the minority does not want to now characterize them as minority requested witnesses, but nonetheless, they were minority requested witnesses. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I want to begin by asking you, Ms. Cooper, about what you just informed us of to make sure that I understand the import of what you're saying. As early as July 25th, the same day President Trump spoke with President Zelensky on the phone and asked for this favor, the same day that President Zelensky thanked the United States for its military support and signaled it was ready to purchase more javelins. On that date, you got inquiries, your staff got inquiries from someone at the Ukrainian embassy who was concerned about the status of the military assistance. Is that correct?
Sir, that's correct. I would say that specifically the Ukrainian embassy staff asked what is going on with Ukrainian security assistance.
And did that connote to you that they were concerned that something was in fact going on with it?
Yes, sir.
And you received, I guess your staff received more than one inquiry on that date. What was the nature of the other inquiry on July 25th?
Sir, that was the one inquiry to my staff, but the other points that I had raised were emails reflecting outreach to the State Department.
So the Ukrainian embassy was also contacting the State Department to find out about its portion of military assistance?
Yes, sir.
And was that similarly a concern about what's going on with our military aid?
It was similarly a question about what's going on with security assistance.
And your staff or one of the other department staff also heard in August additional inquiries from the Ukrainian embassy about a potential holdup in the military assistance?
Sir, I want to be careful about how I phrase this. My staff recall having had meetings with Ukrainian embassy representatives during the month of August, and they believe that the topic came up at some point during those meetings, but they don't recall the precise date or specifically what the nature of the discussion was.
But your staff at least gleaned from those conversations that the Ukrainian embassy was aware that there was some kind of a hold on the assistance.
Sir, the way I would phrase it is that there was some kind of an issue, yes.
You are now, Ms. Cooper, the third witness before our committee who has testified that the Ukrainians found out about a problem or a hold on the security assistance prior to it becoming public, but you're the first to indicate that that may go back as early as the date of the President's call with President Zelensky. Let me move to a related issue. In August, you testified at your deposition that you met with Kurt Volker, I believe it was on August 20th. The hold on security assistance was still in place. You testified that Ambassador Volker told you that if he could get Zelensky to make a public statement, quote, that would somehow disavow any interference in U.S. elections and would commit to the prosecution of any individuals involved in election interference, it might lift the hold on security assistance. Is that correct?
Sir, I believe that I testified that it was my inference that that would lift the hold on Ukraine's security assistance.
And that was your inference because at the time you were talking about the hold on security assistance?
That's correct. The first part of our conversation was about the hold on security assistance.
And it was during that portion of the conversation that he brought up the effort to get this public statement?
It was during that conversation. I'm not sure I would say it's during that part of the conversation.
What else did you discuss in the conversation?
The only two topics that I recall are the urgency of lifting the hold on security assistance and then him relaying this separate diplomatic effort that I had previously been unaware of.
So you didn't have any discussion about any White House meeting?
Sir, I don't recall specifically talking about the White House meeting, but I've had many conversations about the desire for the White House meeting, so it's likely that that was a part of the conversation.
But the two things you do recall are that you talked about the hold on security assistance and that he brought up this public statement that they wanted Zelensky to get that he thought might be useful.
That is correct, sir.
Mr. Nunes.
Yield to Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Ambassador Hale, Ms. Cooper, thank you both for being here. In his opening, Ranking Member Nunes referenced President Trump's general skepticism of providing aid and the amount of foreign aid being provided to foreign countries. Would you agree with that characterization, Ambassador Hale?
We've often heard at the State Department that the President of the United States wants to make sure that foreign assistance is reviewed scrupulously, to make sure that it's truly in U.S. national interests, and that we evaluate it continuously so that it meets certain criteria that the President's established.
And since his election, is it fair to say that President Trump has looked to overhaul how foreign aid is distributed?
Yes, the NSC launched a foreign assistance review process sometime, I think it was late August or early September 2018.
All right. And throughout both his campaign and his administration, President Trump has repeatedly sought to reframe American foreign policy in economic terms, and as he described, America first. policy, and consistent with that, well before there was a whistleblower talking about a pause on aid to the Ukraine, the President had expressed genuine concern about providing U.S. foreign assistance. To that point, is it fair to say that the President has wanted to ensure that American taxpayer money was being effectively and efficiently spent outside of the United States?
Yes, that is the broad intent of the Foreign Assistance Review, among other goals.
And has the President expressed that he expects our allies to give their fair share of foreign aid, as evidenced by a point that he raised during the July 25th phone call with President Zelensky to that effect?
The principle of greater burden sharing by allies and other like-minded states is an important element of the Foreign Assistance Review.
Is it fair to say that in the Trump administration, U.S. aid is withheld from foreign countries for a number of factors?
Correct.
And you've testified in your prior testimony that it is normal to have delays on aid.
I may have said it that way, but it is certainly an occurrence. It does occur.
In the past year, Ukraine was not the only country to have aid withheld from it. Is that correct?
Correct.
In the past year, was aid withheld from Pakistan?
Yes, sir.
Why was aid withheld from Pakistan?
Excuse me. Because of unhappiness over the policies and behavior of the Pakistani government toward certain proxy groups that were involved in conflicts with the United States.
And in the past year, was aid also withheld from Honduras?
Aid was withheld from the three states in northern Central America, yes.
In the past year, was aid withheld from Lebanon?
Yes, sir.
And when aid was first withheld from Lebanon, were you given a reason why it was withheld?
No.
So having no explanation for why aid is being withheld is not uncommon.
I would say it is not the normal way that we function.
But does happen.
It does happen.
And is it true that when aid was being withheld from Lebanon, that was at the same time aid was being withheld from Ukraine?
Correct, sir.
And you've testified that the aid to Lebanon still hasn't been released. Is that right?
That is correct.
All right. But the aid to Ukraine was released on September 11th, correct?
I read that, yes.
Right. So it's fair to say that aid has been withheld from several countries across the globe for various reasons, and in some cases for reasons that are still unknown just in the past year.
Correct, sir.
So the assertion's been made that President Trump's Ukraine policy changed when there was a pause in the aid, or the aid was withheld. Is that an accurate statement?
That was not the way I understood things to be happening at the time. We were not given an explanation.
And in terms of our policy, in terms of aid to Ukraine, you've described it as very robust.
Our aid to Ukraine?
Yes.
Yes.
As evidenced by President Trump's policy decision to provide lethal defensive weapons, Javelin missiles.
It was very robust, yes, sir.
And that was a decision that President Trump made that the prior administration, President Obama, had not done. Lethal weapons had not been provided to Ukraine in the Obama administration, correct?
I was not involved in Ukrainian affairs during the Obama administration, so I don't feel competent to address that.
And when aid to Ukraine was put on pause, I believe you've testified that there may have been concern by Secretary Kent and by Ambassador Taylor that it was contributing to a potentially negative effect on U.S.-Ukraine relations. Do you agree with that?
Well, the State Department position was to advocate for the continuation of that assistance as an important element, in fact, a key element of our strategy to support Ukraine against Russia.
My time's expired. I yield back.
Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for testifying tonight. I'm delighted to follow Mr. Ratcliffe because he just perfectly summarized the defense that my Republican colleagues are mounting of this behavior. And the defense goes like this. The president is acting on some deep historical concern, apparently invisible concern, about corruption, and that because he's so concerned about corruption in Ukraine, he's holding up aid and being prudent and judicious. The first part of that is pretty easy to dispose of because President Trump wasn't worried about corruption in Ukraine. In fact, in the two conversations he had with the president of Ukraine on April 21st and July 25th, not once does the President of the United States use the word or mention corruption to the President. The second part of that is a little bit more interesting, that he's just being prudent and holding up aid. That's not just wrong, it's illegal. Because, Ms. Cooper, and I want you to help us walk through this, since the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, the President has not had the authority to, on a whim or out of prudence, or as my Republicans say, because of a general skepticism of foreign aid, to stop foreign aid. Ms. Cooper, under our Constitution, it's the Congress, not the President, that controls the power of the purse, correct?
Yes, sir.
And the security assistance that was authorized to Ukraine was authorized and appropriated by the Congress, correct?
Yes, sir.
So Congress is also concerned about corruption. It wants to ensure that American foreign assistance is spent wisely and does not worsen corruption. And so when Congress authorized this money, it built in conditions, just as Mr. Ratcliffe suggested. By law, Ukraine wouldn't get all the money until it demonstrated that it had undertaken substantial anti-corruption reforms. Ms. Cooper, under the law, the Department of Defense works with the State Department and other agencies to establish anti-corruption benchmarks and determine whether Ukraine has sufficiently met those benchmarks, correct?
That's correct. That provision pertains to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative.
And that's a legally specified process. That's not the President in the Oval Office manifesting a general skepticism of foreign aid, right? That's
Sir,
a process.
It is a congressionally mandated process, yes, sir.
So did that process take place for the DoD funding that was held up in July?
Sir, the process that took place for the certification took place prior to the May certification to the U.S. Congress.
So, right. Not only did it take place before, as required by law, but months before President Trump froze the money, the Department of Defense, in consultation with state, sent a letter to Congress certifying, and you said this in your opening statement, the government of Ukraine has taken substantial actions to make defense institutional reforms for the purposes of decreasing corruption, increasing accountability, and sustaining improvements of combat capability enabled by U.S. assistance. So by the time President Trump froze the aid, the Department of Defense had spent weeks, if not months, determining that the Ukrainian government met every requirement in the law and made significant strides in combating corruption. Is that correct?
That is correct. We made that determination in May.
So this wasn't about corruption. The timeline proves it. And in fact, if there was any doubt about what was going on here, the chairman referred to your inference from the conversation with Ambassador Volker that if the Ukraine made a statement committing to the investigations, the aid would be lifted. You covered that with the chairman. And then, of course, we have the press conference of October 17th when Mick Mulvaney let the cat fully out of the bag. He revealed that President Trump talked to him about, and I quote Mick Mulvaney here, the corruption related to the DNC server, and admitted that, quote, that's why we held up the money. Any other explanation for the hold is a farce. Now, in my remaining 30 seconds, just so that people understand what I referred to, in the 1970s, Richard Nixon just arbitrarily decided, I don't know, it was because he had a general skepticism of foreign aid or what his motives were, but Richard Nixon decided to hold up congressionally mandated aid. And as a result, Congress went to work and passed the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which prohibits the president from withholding congressionally appropriated funds without the approval of Congress for any reason. Is that correct, Ms. Cooper?
Sir, I am not a lawyer, but that approximates my understanding of the provision of the Impoundment Control Act.
Okay, I'll go with that approximates. Thank you very much, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Conaway.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Paul Harvey said, this is the rest of the story, and my colleague failed to put the right emphasis on certain issues with respect to the certification. DOD certification was not corruption writ large throughout the entire country of Ukraine. It was narrowly focused on defense institutional reforms and combat capability. Isn't that correct, Ms. Cooper?
That's correct, sir.
First off, Ms. Cooper, thank you for being here this afternoon. I appreciate that. But my colleague seemed to leave that out as original. He read it when we read your statement, but he left off the corrective emphasis. So the certification in May didn't really speak to the broader concept of corruption throughout the rest of Ukraine that the president would be familiar with, or the rest of us would be familiar with.
Sir, the May certification was specific to the defense sector,
Thank you.
defense industry, and it did reference the importance of civilian control of the military, which relates more broadly to
Right, but I think all of
Parliament.
us would argue, or none of us, I think, would argue that that fixes corruption throughout the rest of the country. Mr. Cooper, maybe you can shed some light on the specific details. We talk about this, the security assistance program, $250 million. Some would argue that because the pause, that people died in August because of the pause. Can you help us understand exactly what obligated, and was there things that were about to be delivered to Ukraine? Was Ukraine out of ammunition? Were they out of javelins? Were they out of all this stuff? And that because of this pause, they didn't get certain lethal equipment that they needed in order to protect their folks during the month of August?
Sir, we will deliver all of the equipment.
I understand. I was trying to get a timeline,
And
Mr. Cooper.
there was no shortfall in equipment deliveries that were expected within that time frame. Obligate means that you're putting the funding on contract.
Okay, and that's
And you're
contracts
starting the process.
Yeah, those contracts will be fulfilled fourth quarter perhaps, or whatever it was.
Sir, I have to say I'm a policy official. I am not a contracting expert, but my understanding is that we will be able to make up for lost time in the
Sure.
contracting process.
Fantastic. You go through 3 or 4 steps that you went to because you disagreed with the hold being placed on the assistance, and I certainly agree with that. But did you get any kind of criticism from the folks that you deal with because
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Cooper, Ukraine is the first line of defense against Russia's aggression and expansion into Europe. Numerous witnesses testify that Ukraine is in fact vulnerable to Russian influence and control. At your deposition, sir, you testified that providing security assistance is, quote, vital to helping the Ukrainians be able to defend themselves, end quote. What did you mean by that, sir?
That we have a longstanding policy of helping Ukraine become a resilient state in order to be able to defend itself. We want a reliable and resilient and self-reliant security and economic partner in Ukraine that can stand up to Russian intimidation and aggression.
You testified at the time of Russia's 2014 attack that the Ukrainian armed forces were, quote, significantly less capable than it is today, end quote. Would you say, sir, that Ukrainian forces were outmatched by Russia's military in important ways?
I did not so testify. I think I'm Ambassador Hale, and of course, Ms. Cooper may wish to
Madam Cooper,
respond.
would you like to comment?
I'm sorry, I do believe that was my deposition, but could you just repeat the question briefly?
So during the time of Russia's 2014 attack, the Ukrainian armed forces were, quote, significantly less capable than it is today. Would you say that the Ukrainian forces were outmatched by Russia's military in critical ways?
Absolutely.
Are the Ukrainian forces now completely self-sufficient in your mind, essentially in their ability to deter Russian aggression?
No, sir, they have a long way to go.
Would you say that the Ukrainian armed forces are now completely self-sufficient, or how much of an impact does the U.S. need to have in terms of that deterrence, and how critical is the relationship between both Ukraine and the U.S.?
Sir, the Ukrainians are on the right path to be able to provide for their own security, but they will still need U.S. and allied support for quite some time. And they need that support in the form of, tangible assistance as well as political and diplomatic support.
So this question is to the both of you. Why was Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea so significant in your mind? Madam Cooper.
Russia violated the sovereignty of Ukraine's territory. Russia illegally annexed territory that belonged to Ukraine. They also denied Ukraine access to its naval fleet at the time, and to this day, Russia is building a capability on Crimea designed to expand Russian military power projection far beyond the immediate region.
In 2014, were there concerns in Washington, here in Washington, and European capitals that Russia might not stop in Ukraine?
I was not in my current position in 2014, but it is my understanding that there was significant fear about where a Russian aggression would stop.
So what about today? If the U.S. were to withdraw its military support of Ukraine, what would effectively happen?
It is my belief that if we were to withdraw our support, it would embolden Russia. It would also validate Russia's violation of international law.
And which country stands to benefit the most, would stand to benefit the most from such a withdrawal?
Russia.
Ambassador Taylor testified about the importance of the U.S. upholding the international system. And it has underwritten peace in Europe since the end of World War II. A critical aspect of defending that system is ensuring that Russia cannot change its borders by military force. That is why there is strong bipartisan support for providing Ukraine with security assistance. And that is why it is so incredibly destructive of the President of the United States to withhold this assistance as part of a scheme to pressure Ukraine into investigating a debunked conspiracy theory and attack former Vice President Biden. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. As Army Reserve surgeon, I can say, as both of you had, that I served proudly for 2 Republicans and 2 Democrat presidents myself. I want to go to Ms. Cooper, if I can, page 3. Said, I heard the President had directed the Office of Management and Budget to hold funds because of his concerns about corruption in Ukraine. And, you know, you're coming from the DOD side here. You know, I served a year in Iraq, and it was important, and I think it's something that the Army always does, as I have seen, that we don't want to deliver aid or assistance if it's going to some corrupt or being delivered in some corrupt way. In other words, if we're going to build a medical treatment facility for the Iraqis, we want to make sure we're not getting charged 10 times as much. I mean, we're concerned about corruption in general when we're delivering funds through the DOD. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So I think that's a normal thing to want to be concerned about. And we would do that in Iraq, and especially if we're providing payment for something. So I just want to go through a few things with you, because multiple witnesses have testified that the action to provide javelins to Ukraine by the Trump administration demonstrated strong U.S. support to Ukraine. Ambassador Yovanovitch, in her deposition, said President Trump's decision to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine, that our policy actually got stronger over the last 3 years. She also said, in terms of lethal assistance, we all felt it was very significant with that this administration made the decision to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. Ambassador Taylor said it was a substantial improvement in that this administration provided Javelin anti-tank weapons. Very strong political message that said the Americans are willing to provide more than blankets. Ambassador Volker testified that providing lethal defensive arms to Ukraine has been extremely helpful. Mr. Volker also stated, MREs and blankets and all, that's fine, but if you're being attacked with mortars and artilleries and tanks, you need to be able to fight back. Secretary George Kent stated that javelins are incredibly effective weapons at stopping armed advance, and the Russians are scared of them. Special Advisor Catherine Croft stated, the javelins help Ukraine defend themselves. A decision to provide javelins, we believe, is counter to Russian interest. Do you dispute what these witnesses have testified to, including Ambassador Yovanovitch, Taylor, Volker, and others?
Sir, I absolutely agree that the Javelin system is an important capability and that this was a very important decision to support Ukraine with this capability.
Thank you. And you already testified that you're personally proud of the Trump administration's decision to arm Ukraine with javelins, correct?
That is correct, sir.
So one of the things on page 3 tonight, you were talking about a meeting July 26th, and after that you said, I was aware the national security community expressed unanimous support for resuming the funding as in the U.S. national security interests. That's correct? You said that tonight?
That's correct, sir.
So I guess I take a little question with resuming, because we don't want to resume as is. Would that be correct? Because as is would not include javelins.
Sir, I'm not sure I'm following.
Well, what I was going to say, in the previous administration, javelins were not provided, even though they could have been. President Obama stopped the javelins. He could have delivered javelins, let's put it that way.
Sir, I think I should clarify what I meant by that statement. Resuming was just referring to the fact that OMB had placed a hold on the assistance, so we weren't spending.
Okay.
And I wanted to resume the spending.
Okay, well,
so that we could maintain this policy, maintain the strength.
maintain the policy, but I guess what I'm asking, there is a difference, and I think Under Secretary Hale, you might, I thought I saw you nodding, the difference being that as it's resumed, in this case, now it included javelins, which the Obama administration denied. Is that correct?
It is true that the Trump administration approved the release of defensive lethal assistance to include Javelin, whereas the previous administration did not support that policy.
Mr. Hale, do you have a comment on that?
That seems correct. I defer to Ms. Cooper as the expert.
Okay. Well, I think we can conclude that more than blankets and MREs has been helping the Ukrainians, and the lethal defensive weapons are something the Trump administration has approved, and it's a benefit to all of us. Thank you.
Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here this evening. You know, there's this mystery surrounding the hold on the aid in July, it appears. But back in May, Ms. Cooper, I believe you said that there was aid that was conditioned, but you certified in May that the conditions had been met. And they included progress on command and control reform, commitment to pursue defense industry reform, and pass laws to enable government-to-government procurement. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
So then when you find out in July that they're concerned about corruption, you're scratching your head, right? So,
Yes, ma'am, we did not
figuratively.
understand.
And do you know of any effort that was undertaken then to assess the corruption in Ukraine in June, July, August?
Ma'am, as I believe I said in my deposition, the only specific discussions that I am aware of related to that series of interagency meetings, the sub-PCC, as we called it, the PCC, Policy Coordination Committee, and the Deputy Small Group. And in those meetings, participants did discuss the degree to which corruption was a concern and the degree to which there was progress. And my recollection of what the participants said in these meetings was that there was a very positive sense that progress was being made.
So you have these meetings, progress is being made, nothing really changes from May until September that would then trigger the release of the money, except a whistleblower came forward.
Ma'am, I do not know what triggered the release of the funding.
All right. The fact that there was reference made to money being withheld for other countries was made by some of our colleagues. But in those situations, in countries like Pakistan, Lebanon, they're multi-year funding streams, correct?
Ma'am, those accounts fall outside of my purview, so I cannot answer that question.
Okay. Well, I've been told that that is indeed the case, so that there's not the immediate angst or hit financially that would potentially accrue. But the difference, as I see it, in Ukraine as compared to these other countries is that Ukraine is engaged in a hot war with Russia right now. And it seems that withholding that money was irresponsible, considering that they had made all of this, taken steps to meet all the conditions that we had requested of them, and Congress had appropriated the funds. Is that not the case?
Ma'am, I and my DoD colleagues advocated strenuously for the release of these funds because of their national security importance.
So basically, the entire interests of the Department of Defense and State Department were consistently supportive of releasing these funds. Everyone was mystified as to why the funds had been withheld, and everyone's running around trying to get an answer, and you're getting kind of obtuse responses saying it was the president because of corruption. Now, what we see is that President Zelensky gets elected in April. The expectation is that Vice President Pence is going to attend the inauguration in September, and then the president pulls the carpet out from under him in terms of him going. And then he proceeds in June or July to withhold the funds. There is a concerted effort by the President of the United States to act in a manner that is not consistent with our interest in wanting to protect Ukraine and help them deal with the Russian aggression at its border. Would you agree with that?
Ma'am, I have, advocated for this security assistance, and I have advocated for high-level engagement with the government of Ukraine because I think both are in the national security interest.
I yield back.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Chairman. Undersecretary, Assistant Secretary, thank you both for being here. You're both recognized as experts, dedicated public servants, and I got to tell you, being the President of the United States is perhaps the most complicated endeavor in the history of the world. No one could do it without people like you to provide that backbone that you do, and thank you for doing that. I don't mean to repeat the same questions ad nauseum, but I think we reached a point of nauseum, I don't know, sometime yesterday or some time ago. It's some repetitive here, and you'll forgive me for doing that. Although, Mr. Cooper, I do have some questions based on some things you've said previously, and I just want to add, for clarification, there's a question about these emails that I think they claimed withholding, described withholding the aid, and they had come from Capitol Hill or from someone on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Is that true?
Sir, are you referring to my statement today or something previous?
I believe this was previous, a question we had previous. Are you aware of such an email?
I'm sorry, I don't think I have enough information to make an assessment. Is it from a particular page in my deposition?
No, it's just reporting that we've heard, that there may have been communications with you with someone on the Foreign Affairs Committee on the Hill. Is that not true?
That there may have been communications with me?
Yes, email with you.
Sir, I'm not aware.
Okay, thank you. And for clarification as well, someone may have asked you or queried you from the Ukrainian embassy about the withholding of aid. Is that true? Did you hear from them?
Sir, I testified earlier that the communication from the Ukrainian embassy was to my staff, and my staff mentioned this to me after my deposition. The only specific communication that I recollect with the Ukrainians about this specific issue was on, I believe it was September 5th, at a reception at the Ukrainian embassy.
And just to bore down on that just a little bit, was that just a query generally about the forthcoming aid, or was it specific regarding them being aware that the aid was being withheld?
Sir, just to be clear, the September 5th conversation that I had was specific to the hold. There was an awareness of that, and there was a question of concern.
Okay, thank you. You know, Ms. Cooper, well, to both of you, Undersecretary Hale as well, at the end of the day, it really does, and I've done this before, it really does come down to this. The transcript I'm holding up is a transcript of the phone call between President Zelensky and President Trump that I would hope every American would take the opportunity to read. It's only a few pages long. And much more information beyond that is maybe helpful to inform, but it really comes down to those conversations, those few sentences. But Mr. Hale, going quickly through a series of questions, and I have your answers here, so this won't take long, and you've answered them generally anyway. You agree the United States should evaluate whether a country is worthy of our aid. Is that fair to say?
Yes, sir.
And you understand as well that President Trump has been skeptical generally of foreign aid and some of the money that we've given. Is that fair as well?
I think so.
And I think that's been fairly consistent. He's done that since before he was elected, I think. Others in the process have testified that Ukraine has a long history of corruption. That's not going to surprise any one of us. We've talked about that about 1,000 times. Do you think it was right that President Trump would test, is a word I think you used previously, that he would test President Zelensky prior to providing some of the security assistance?
President Zelensky was new.
Yes.
I had met him in February. I was impressed by him. But I think it was understandable for the administration, as a new president in Ukraine was coming to office, to understand better what that president's policies would be and attitude toward the United States.
And see, Undersecretary, I think that's key because we've had it referred to while the DOD had completed their review about the same time. But this was a person who was elected and we knew nothing about him. He didn't have a history of governance in Ukraine. He came really a little bit like President Trump himself. He did not come from a public background that we would have much information on him. And it seems prudent, to, as you said, to kind of test him and to see if he was serious about Ukraine. At some point, I'm going to conclude, I believe it was about Labor Day, the Secretary was able to engage the President on the security assistance. About the same time, by the way, that you had some others, Secretary, Vice President Pence and Bolton as well as a burden sharing review was completed, and shortly thereafter the aid was released. Is that your understanding?
I was never informed as to why the assistance was released. I did read about it.
Okay, well, those events did happen, and it seemed like they were the reason the aid was released, but thank you both, and I yield back.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here, and thank you for your service. You've both been asked about the importance of this military assistance as it affects Ukrainian sovereignty and its importance because of potential greater ambitions by the Russians. Let me try to put it in context, and please get your reaction from both of you, from someone who had been there before, a renowned international policy expert on such things, Zbigniew Brzezinski. His quote seems to strike home today. He wrote, "Russia can either be an empire or a democracy, but it cannot be both. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine subordinated and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire." Your thoughts of how this puts this into context today, please?
Sir, I think that is a very powerful and accurate quote.
I would agree.
Ms. Cooper, you talked about emails that were drawn to your attention, they were sent to your staff, is that correct?
The emails that I discussed this evening were emails sent to my staff. That is correct.
Okay. I think, first of all, it's important to point this out, that it's not something you are aware of, but it points to a larger issue that the Defense Department and the State Department have refused to comply with a duly issued subpoena to provide this committee with documents that would further shed light on when precisely the Ukrainians knew about the hold. So this isn't something you're aware of, but there's untold information out there being blocked that would draw greater light and help us understand. Is there anything else out there that you're aware of, or possibilities that are out there with DOD or the State Department which could help us shed light on what the Ukrainians knew and when they knew it?
Sir, I have shared with the committee all that I recollect, but I have not done an exhaustive investigation. So I really can't speculate on what else might be available by combing through all of the Defense Department records, which are substantial.
Did the State Department or the Department of Defense ask you for your information, or did they coordinate with you to get information you had?
Sir, I was told not to destroy anything, and our IT personnel have been collecting documents, is my understanding. So that occurs without the individual having to.
But they were collecting it and passing it on to State or DOD, is that correct?
I'm sorry, sir, could you repeat that?
You said your department was collecting it. Well, they weren't passing that on to you, they were passing it on to the State Department?
Sir,
or Department of Defense?
This is what they reported to me. I have not seen the documents that have been collected. I only know those documents that I have produced or that my staff has brought to my attention or that I have received. So, no, I do not know what has happened with the documents that have been collected.
Same general question to you, sir.
I requested and was granted access to documents that I either originated or that had been sent to me that were relevant to the pertinent matters of this investigation during a finite time period. I don't have really information about what else is going on in terms of other documents that I did not produce or that I did not receive. I do know there was a move to gather them, and I understood generally, indirectly, and informally that they have been gathered. That's the extent of my knowledge. Is not my area of responsibility.
Yes, but did they pass them on to you, or did they pass them on to the administration and somehow?
The only documents I received, sir, were those within the parameters I described. What I requested, which was those and given, were the documents that either I produced or that were sent to me relevant to the matters we're discussing today.
Thank you. I yield back to the chairman.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you to both of our witnesses for your service today. Ms. Cooper, I wanted to start with you. You spoke eloquently of the threat of Russia when it illegally annexed Crimea, how that's a threat not only to Ukraine, but it's also a threat to Europe and the United States, a national security challenge. and I sit on the House Armed Services Committee. We know that the most important support for Ukraine in terms of lethal defensive aid is in the forms of javelins. Would you agree with that?
Yes, ma'am.
And which administration were those javelins made available to Ukraine?
This administration, the Trump administration.
And not the Obama administration?
That is correct.
Both of you, have you ever spoken with the president about Ukraine aid?
No, I have not.
No, ma'am.
Undersecretary Hale, you testified that you had no direct knowledge of